Right
So,
on.
all right. Hey, thanks so much. I'm gonna open it up to everybody now, okay? Thanks,
All right.
Colin.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
How we doing, y'all? Congressman, thanks for joining us.
You bet. Great to be with you.
Awesome. Give some people just a second to hop on.
You bet.
I'm sure there's no lack of activity going on in your world these days, huh?
Yeah. Yeah. Challenging times.
All right. Congressman, on these meetings, do you get some pretty awesome backgrounds? Like one of my students, Aaron, looks like he's in Hawaii. You know, any of those awesome backgrounds?
I wanted to be with Aaron in Hawaii. That looked much nicer than what I see out my window. Yeah, I find that I can only use my fun backgrounds when I'm on with my family, because when I'm talking about some of the serious issues of the day, having a background of, me on Tatooine doesn't seem fitting.
Yeah, yeah. If Nancy Pelosi could have a fancy background, what do you think it would be?
That's a really good question. Maybe something like the Vatican. She's a very active Catholic, and I could envision her with a cathedral behind her or something.
Gotcha. Awesome. Well, hey, thank you so much for joining us today. This week we have a series of presentations kind of dedicated to the class of 2020, aimed at providing and giving our class of 2020 resources to tackle this next chapter of their lives. And we're thrilled to have you today. We're so grateful that you were willing to step up and join with us and speak to us today during this challenging time. For those that are tuning in tomorrow, we're gonna have healthy eating and living tips with Melissa Conley. So tune in tomorrow as well. But without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our congressman. And once again, thank you so much for joining us. For everybody joining today, this is going to be recorded. So if you don't want your face or profile being recorded, please turn off your video feed and mute your Zoom account as well. So, all right. Thank you very much. Congressman, the floor is yours.
Thanks. It's good to be with you. I was going to say it's good to see everybody, but all I see is your names right now. So my goal is not to talk at you, but hopefully to have a discussion with you. I'll say a few things up front, and then if you've got questions, I'd love to hear them. And let me maybe just start with the obvious, which is for those of you who are graduating this year, it's a particularly challenging time. And I want to just say I'm sorry that you're having the end of your time in high school be so disrupted, first and probably foremost by a global pandemic. And then obviously the massive amounts of pain and anger that we've seen, not just in our region, but around our country this past week. Obviously on top of a public health crisis that has led to the death of 100,000 Americans. Last week we saw a Black American murdered in Minneapolis by a uniformed police officer. And, obviously it was a horrific act. It was heartbreaking. And I think some of the anger and pain that you're seeing is that George Floyd's murder was a violation of the social contract, that sense of what we owe each other, and that we agree to uphold as members of society. And part of that is trust that those who are hired to keep us safe will do that. And Obviously, that makes this a really challenging time. And I guess to ground any sort of advice that I have to you as graduates in the times that we're going through, I want to acknowledge I was at a prayer vigil in Tacoma on Saturday, and I'll confess up front, it was really hard. It was hard in part because people are really hurting right now, and my genetic predisposition when I see people I care about hurting is to want to hug them, and when I'm hurting, to get a hug in return. And we can't really do that right now in the realm of social distancing and all that we're going through. So that was tough, and it was also just challenging because everybody's, wearing a masks, and our, to some degree, our faces are our windows to the rest of the world of how we're feeling, and we couldn't really even share that. But one of the ministers got up at the vigil that I attended in Tacoma on Saturday and said something that I thought was actually pretty important, and that is a recognition that each of us as Americans has a role to play in trying to fix the things that need fixing in our country. Certainly inequities related to police violence, but there are other inequities in our country related to housing and education and healthcare and criminal justice, to name just a few. And the direction that was provided in that event was to recognize that these are problems that all of us need to be a part of solving. And whether it's working in a time of illness to heal sick people, or working in a time of massive economic disruption to try to help people just make ends meet. Each of us has a role to play. I guess I also want to acknowledge, part of my job is to be a big part of making that change. I just hopped off a call with the leaders of the Congressional Black Caucus, which is a group of my colleagues in Congress who are African Americans, and we were just talking about some of the action that needs to take place from here. And it's important to listen, and maybe that's another message as you all go out into the world. To listen and to learn, to hear other people's lived experiences, because we all have different experiences based on where we come from and what our upbringing is, and what the circumstances of our birth are. And I think there's, to some degree, an obligation by each of us, a responsibility by each of us, to try to understand other people's experiences. And so that's part of what I just did. Stemming from that, there are actions that you'll see out of Congress, both to try to address some of the issues related to policing and police brutality, but also to target other inequities facing our nation. So that's part of my job, is to listen and to learn and to stand in solidarity, but also importantly to take action to address the things that need to be fixed in this country. The only other thing I want to just share with you is, obviously, we're also dealing with the largest economic crisis of my lifetime, and the largest public health crisis of my lifetime. I know I say that as someone who's nearly 30 years older than most of the high schoolers here, which makes me feel really old. And I am very conscious of the fact, and I published a piece in the Seattle Times a couple months ago. We keep hearing people say, when do things get back to normal? And, the piece I published in the Seattle Times a couple months ago expressed the need to get to a new normal, that, the normal that we have isn't really working for everybody. And I appreciated that former President Obama made a similar case with regard to some of the racial inequities in our country. Listen, the old normal in our country has meant that there are 30 million people in this country that don't have paid sick leave or paid family leave. And maybe we need a new normal where people don't have to choose between their job and their health, or the health of their family. in the old normal, we have a healthcare system that is still inequitable and where too many people are faced with the prospect of going broke when they get sick. And maybe we need a new normal that builds on the progress made under the Affordable Care Act to say everybody should have access to quality, affordable healthcare in this country. And, maybe we need a new normal that recognizes that, things like access to the internet in this country, aren't just about whether you can watch Tiger King on Netflix, which by the way was bonkers, but are also about, if your school gets canceled, whether you can keep learning. And if you were made unemployed in the midst of this pandemic, whether you can apply for unemployment assistance, or if you run a small business, whether you can keep operating. And, I'm consistently of the belief, and we were working on this in my office before this pandemic, access to the internet is almost like electrification was in generations past. You just need it. And for a lot of the people in the district I represent, they don't have it. So there are a lot of inequities around housing, around access to the internet, and around other things that frankly were problems before this pandemic that this pandemic has really shined a bright light on. I guess the final thing I'll say, and then I'd love to hear what's on your minds, is I raise these issues as problems that I'm working on, but as also problems that each of you is empowered to do something to address. For those of you who are 18, it really matters that you vote, that you lend your vote, you're not just your vote, but also your voice to the process of making change in this country. And don't for a second think that your voice doesn't matter. As you've looked at change in this country, some of the change made in the civil rights era happened by young people who added their voices to a movement. You've seen young people who have shown more courage on the issue of trying to stop gun violence in our society and to make sure that we don't see school shootings. Frankly, we've seen more courage from high schoolers than we have from members of Congress. If you look at the issue of climate change, which I think is frankly the greatest existential threat facing our planet, and demands action, some of the most impactful voices for action are young people. And so I just, as you continue on your path, I want to just encourage you to continue to use your voices, continue to use your votes, because that's how our system of government works. And frankly, we need you. So let me stop there. Like I said, I'd rather have a dialogue with you than talk at you. I'd love to hear what's on your minds and answer whatever questions you've got.
Hey, Mr. Kilmer, I have a question for you. So I was a bit wondering about how we can kind of foster better dialogue between opposing, political sides these days.
Yeah.
I've noticed a lot online, neither side can really get a word in because the other side will kind of, shut them down before any meaningful dialogue is reached. So, and I've also seen that sometimes in schools, not with teachers, but, student to student. So I'm just wondering how we can, foster a healthier, more dynamic dialogue between opposing views.
Tyler, is it Tyler? I
Yes,
see
sir.
the name, but I wasn't sure if that, okay.
No, yeah, sir.
It's Tyler, it's a really good question. And, I think one of the things I would encourage, I think sometimes, what's become more challenging over time is even the sources of information are largely, designed to affirm our worldview, right? My news feed on social media largely just affirms my beliefs and doesn't necessarily challenge them. And so I almost have to seek out information that might challenge me to think differently about something. The same thing, if I asked you or your parents what cable news channel they watch, I can pretty much tell you something about their political perspectives based on what channel they watch. And that hasn't always been the case. So some of that requires, one, in terms of actively soliciting information that may challenge your worldview. I think that is important. Some of that is actually also trying to invite people in dialogue with you who may think differently than you do. I will tell you how I do that, Tyler. I chair a group in Congress called the Bipartisan Working Group. And it's a group of a dozen Democrats and a dozen Republicans who meet each week for breakfast. And actually, we've continued to meet virtually throughout this pandemic. And it's kind of a meeting in three parts. The first part of the meeting, anybody who's working on something where they want to invite collaboration or co-sponsorship is given an opportunity to do that. So for example, I just a couple months back introduced a bill focused on trying to reduce student debt. And in that meeting, I pitched the bill and said, here's the problem I'm trying to solve, here's how I'm proposing to solve it. And one of my colleagues, a Republican from Indiana, said, sign me up, I'm happy to work with you on that. Second part of the meeting, we talk about what's going on in Congress that week or that month. And those can be feisty conversations because there are stark differences in our country on issues, whether we're talking about healthcare or climate change or taxes or impeachment or you name it. You know, there are people who can have sharp elbows, but I'm increasingly of the belief that good democracy is a little bit like a good relationship. Right? You don't necessarily agree with your partner on everything. You got to be able to talk to each other and listen to each other and show respect to each other. And then the third part of the meeting, we talk about big, hairy issues facing the country and how we might be able to find some common ground. And I don't want to mislead you into thinking we're, you know, holding hands around the room and singing Kumbaya around the table, but, you know, we're not, you know, closing our eyes and doing trust falls into each other's arms. We stopped doing that after we dropped a guy. But it is sort of the hour of each week where I find myself thinking, not only do we need to do more of that as a Congress, we need to do more of that as a country. And so I would encourage you, again, you know, that's hard, right? It's hard to find people who disagree with you. And even on social media, I had a constituent who said, you know, he said, I don't know anybody who voted for Donald Trump. And he said, I went on my Twitter and tweeted, I want to have coffee with a Trump voter. And I had a bunch of Trump voters call me a snowflake. And I had a bunch of my Democratic friends call me a traitor. And, you know, so how do I do that? So it's hard, but I think if you do it with purpose and with the sense of actually trying to understand where people are coming from a bit better, I think there's value in it.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
You bet.
Hi, Mr. Kilmer. My name's Mary. I'm just wondering what pieces of legislation you're advocating for that confront police brutality in response to the deaths of people like Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So there's a few bills that we're working on right now. There's more to come. One is a resolution condemning police brutality and the use of excessive force by law enforcement, and that calls for the end of sort of militarized policing practices. Among other things, that resolution calls on the Department of Justice to reinstitute its authority to investigate instances of police brutality and racial profiling, as well as police departments that repeatedly violate civil rights. It also calls for the adoption of unbiased law enforcement policies at all levels of government to reduce the disparate impact of police brutality and the use of force on Black and brown people and others who've been historically marginalized in our country. There's a separate bill that is designed to provide incentives for local police organizations to adopt performance-based standards to ensure that the incidents of deadly force, of misconduct, are reduced through training protocols and through better management. So that's primarily a funding bill. And then there's a separate bill, and as you can imagine, I've spent a good amount of time in recent days, talking with community leaders within the African American community, and at their urging, also with law enforcement. And one of the one of the things that I had one of our local law enforcement leaders say, what I saw in Minnesota was appalling and sickening. And he said, we would never allow that to be part of our training. And he said, so much of this gets at training. And so there's a bill that I'm signing on as a sponsor to that's called the Police Training and Independent Review Act, which would provide federal funding for states to have law enforcement academies do sensitivity training on racial bias, on cultural diversity. It would have federal funds to incent states to adopt laws that require independent investigations and prosecution of law enforcement officers in cases where one of them or more is alleged to have used deadly force or committed police brutality. So those are some things that we're working on. Frankly, I think it's important to address the issues around policing. Beyond that, there are other actions that need to be taken, though, to address other inequities in our society facing Black and Brown Americans. We know, unfortunately, that racism exists in this country, and some of that is in hearts and minds, but some of that is in policy. And there are things, everything from funding. So one of the things that President Obama did when he was in office was to make sure that there were civil rights divisions in every agency and that they were beefed up with adequate funding to protect civil rights. Unfortunately, the current administration has de-emphasized that, and that's something that needs to be fixed too. So thanks for the question, Mary.
Thank you.
You bet.
So I was wondering about how you feel about the difference between how the founding fathers saw the House of Representatives representing one per every 30,000 people to how it is now, where it's possibly one to between 150,000 people to 750,000 people.
It's a really big challenge, Shane. And I don't say that, from a poor me sense of it's a really big district to represent. And, so the district I represent goes from Tacoma to the coast. So I represent all of Kitsap County, about 70% of Tacoma, and then Clallam, Jefferson, Grays Harbor, and most of Mason counties. And that's a really diverse district, far more diverse than probably anything that our founding fathers saw. There's 11 Native American tribes represented in Washington's 6th Congressional District. There are communities that are very densely populated urban areas, and there are really, really rural areas, and everything in between. I think the so there is some challenge to it. What I would tell you is the other challenge is for the American people. Sometimes I think if you feel like your voice is one of 750,000, it can feel like your voice doesn't matter as much as it actually does. Frankly, part of the reason that I zoom into high school classrooms and pre-coronavirus, visited a lot of high schools and visited a lot of colleges, and wherever there's a gathering of 5 or more people, I try to be there, is to really emphasize to my constituents that I work for you. That's how this works. And I think it's really important for this democratic republic to work, for people to understand that their voice matters. And that's harder with really, really large districts for people to fully appreciate that. I will say I chair a committee now in Congress called the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, which is looking at some systemic reforms to try to have Congress function better on behalf of the American people. We have not yet looked at the size of districts, but there has been some discussion of it and whether that ought to be reconsidered. So thanks for the question.
Hi, I'm Audrey.
Hey, Audrey.
I guess if we feel strongly about like a specific political issue, what's like, I guess, the best and most direct venue to like talk to our representatives?
Yeah, let me, I guess, provide some suggestions in a few different respects. One, in terms of lending your voice in this process, you can email your elected officials, usually through their websites. That's a direct way that gets directly to us. Or you can call. I will tell you, most members generally don't read all of the commentary on their social media sites, largely because it's just a lot of trolls. And I'm just saying that to be honest with you. Sometimes just commenting on a tweet or, on a post on Instagram is not the best way to get to your elected official. Conscious that I'm speaking to a bunch of high school members, so you're probably not sending a lot of snail mail. That's for the best, because when we get sent snail mail, it takes 6 to 8 weeks for us to get it because it has to be screened for anthrax in a facility in the Midwest before it gets to us. So that's not the most effective way. That's in terms of lending your voices. There's also ways to amplify your voices in the political process, whether that be engaging with organizations that work on an issue that you care deeply about. So for example, I had a group of high school students in Tacoma who cared a lot about stopping school-based violence. And they reached out to me and said, if we put together a town hall with some of our classmates, would you participate? I said, absolutely. Similarly, in Jefferson County, there was a group that was focused on climate policy and asked, if we put together a group of students who care about climate, would you engage with us? So that's another avenue for engaging elected officials. And the third is through politics, is through engaging and electing people who share your values. And we have certainly tried in every campaign that I've run to involve young people, because one, frankly, it's experience that I wish I'd had when I was in high school or in college, to be able to be involved in a campaign. And some of it is, I think you have more at stake in our politics now than almost anybody. And so we've tried to involve, and we offer internships and even paid internships for folks who are interested in getting involved. Actually, Colin from my team is on this Zoom, and if you are interested in that and getting some experience and getting to see our political system up close and personally, I certainly welcome you to. You can just email Colin. It's Colin, COLIN, @DerekKilmer.com. And if you have an interest, we'd be happy to talk with you about your interest and see if there's a good way to channel your energies towards the change you want to make.
Awesome, thanks.
You bet, Audrey.
Hi, my name's Jennifer.
Hey, Jennifer.
I am wondering about getting young people who are 18 and 19 and 20 to vote in presidential elections when the last couple of elections have fallen to the Electoral College as opposed to popular voting. Young people tend to say, well, Washington's always a blue state, so why do I have to vote? It won't matter anyway. And I'm wondering where you stand on the Electoral College and what you feel the climate is in our nation towards abolishing that.
Yeah, let me answer that in a few ways, Jennifer. I'll start directly with an answer to your question about the Electoral College. Honestly, I don't like it. And I don't like it because I'm not just a big D Democrat, I'm a small D Democrat too. And I feel like the winner of the national popular vote should be the winner because that's the person who got the most votes. And I think there's some sort of unusual unintended consequences of the Electoral College in terms of where political candidates spend their time It means they write off a whole bunch of states, including, Washington, because it's just perceived as solidly blue. So we don't and probably won't see much of our presidential candidates this year. When I was in the state legislature, I was part of an effort to have our state join something called an interstate compact for the national popular vote. Because it's expected that to do away with the Electoral College, it would actually take a constitutional amendment. This was actually kind of an interesting way to get around it. And that was to have enough states, if you can get to enough states to sign up for that interstate compact, so that it would equal the 270 electoral votes to decide a presidential election, each of those states would commit to having their electors support the winner of the national popular vote. So it would have the same outcome. It would basically say the candidate that wins the national popular vote would automatically, therefore, win the Electoral College. I think that made sense. I was a supporter of that effort and one of the leaders in that effort, because I think that's a much more fair way to decide who becomes our president. The other thing that I would say, though, and I think it's important to acknowledge, and for those of you who didn't see the post that President Obama put up the other day, frankly, elections matter, not just presidential elections, but elections up and down the ballot matter. Having a Congress, in 2018 that, flipped so that the House is now under new management meant that for the first time in more than a decade, you actually saw forward motion on legislation dealing with climate change and forward motion on legislation dealing with LGBTQ equality and forward motion on efforts to reduce the role of money in politics and forward motion on trying to ensure equal pay for equal work so that there aren't gender-based inequities with regard to pay, and that you saw forward motion with regard to reducing gun violence in schools. All of those things happened, frankly, because the House flipped. Similarly, for those of you who are outraged about the state of things, and particularly from the last week, recognize that a lot of the policies regarding police training, a lot of the policies regarding the use of force are set at the local level. And so those local races really matter as well. Our state legislative races, the determinations around how much funding is provided for schools and for teachers like Mr. Prince, that matters as well. That's decided down ballot. That's not decided by Donald Trump or even by your congressman. That's decided by our state legislators. So I know sometimes it's hard to think that any of this stuff matters, but I think we've seen, and hopefully if this year has taught us anything, it's that elections have consequences, and and both your voice and your vote really matter in that regard.
Mr. Kilmer? Yeah. I have a bit not off topic, but on another note about clean energy. With regards to global warming, we obviously want to move to cleaner, more efficient energy. And I'm wondering how that transition from traditional methods to nuclear, hydro, solar, how is that being done in a way, or is it being done in a way where we're not sacrificing economic growth for cleaner energy?
Yeah. So a couple things, actually 3 things. So one, other countries have realized there's jobs to be had in addressing climate change, that there's new technologies and new industries that will be developed, and they see upside in it. And frankly, I think the United States should too, that we should embrace that addressing climate change is not just trying to address a threat, but it may be also trying to build economic opportunity in this country. 2, there are economic consequences of failing to act. There are 3,200 people in the district I represent whose livelihoods are tied to growing shellfish and to our fisheries. And they're already seeing the negative impacts of changing ocean chemistry of ocean acidification stemming from climate change. And so there's real concerns about the failure to act. You know, we saw wildfires burn on the peninsula a couple summers ago that were devastating. And there's a bunch of people in the district I represent whose livelihoods are tied to the wood products industry. And so that is a significant threat. And we know that wildfires get worse as a consequence of climate change. I represent 11 Native American tribes, 4 are coastal tribes that are in the process of trying to move to higher ground because of persistent flooding and more severe storms, not to mention the threat of tsunami. And so there is consequence to those tribes if the United States fails to address climate change. And even the largest employer in our district, the United States Navy, has identified climate change as a threat multiplier, both because of the instability that climate change creates around the world, and because, as you can imagine, most naval bases are on the water. And so as we see rising sea levels and more severe storms, the resilience of those bases is impacted. The third thing I would say is, I think that we can transition with a sense of urgency and in a smart way, but also embracing the notion that we're not going to leave communities behind. I say that as someone who got into this because I lived in a community that kind of got left behind. I grew up in Port Angeles, and when I was in high school was right around the time the timber industry was taking it on the chin. And I saw a lot of my friends' parents lose their jobs and a bunch of my neighbors lose their jobs. And that altered the trajectory of my adult life. And I think we can both say, you know, we can be a part of the rest of the world in combating climate change. And one important way to do that is to have the United States join the rest of the world in being part of the Paris Climate Treaty, which unfortunately President Trump has sought to pull us out of. But also we can put a price on carbon. And we can also say, for those communities and for those workers who, as we transition towards a greener, more renewable future, may be impacted by that, we're going to have policies that say we're not going to leave you behind. We're going to make sure that you have the transition support, the training, so that you can have a 21st century job. So that maybe that was a long answer, but I think it's going to take that kind of comprehensive approach to address it.
No, I appreciate it. I thought it was well answered. Thank you.
Thanks, Tyler.
Hello, Congressman Kilmer.
Hey.
My name is Michael. I was wondering, I know in your job, I'm sure that it's you've often gotten frustrated at slow progress or at a lack of progress. How do you stay motivated and how do you focus on serving in those difficult situations?
Thanks, Michael. So we have a couple mottos on my team. We say, don't agonize, organize, and don't get frustrated, get motivated. I mean, what I have found is it's just, I don't have the mental energy to spare on hand-wringing. I think it is, my hands are much better used working, to actually solve problems for the folks I represent. We certainly see that during this pandemic. There's just a lot of holes in the dam, and part of my job is to try to use every finger and toe to make sure that we're protecting the folks that I represent. And that can be hard. I have a sense of urgency on a lot of the issues that I just talked about. I have a sense of urgency in having, the United States and the rest of the world step up to combating climate change. And it pains me. It pains me to see not only have we failed to make forward motion over the last 3.5 years, I would argue we've gone backwards. And that makes me want to just work harder. I've got a 10-year-old and a 14-year-old, and when I drop them off at school, I want them to be excited about the day, not fearful for their safety. And for the first 6 years that I was in the U.S. House, I cannot tell you how many moments of silence had been held after mass shootings in this country. I can tell you how many moments of action there were. There were zero. And thankfully that's changed, and I don't say that in a partisan way. I think thankfully the House is under new management, and we've seen a focus on that we hadn't seen in the past years. And so Sometimes change takes longer and is slower than I want it to be. But you know, you got to keep rowing.
Thank you.
You bet.
Congressman Killer.
Yeah.
My name is Victor. I was wondering how you think our daily lives will be affected by the coronavirus after everything is reopened.
So there's a few different ways to answer that. And part of it deals with the question of after everything is opened. Because, you know, listen, there will be some, you know, one opened may look different, right? I mean, use the largest employer in our district as an example, the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. In the nearly 130-year existence of the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, they had never had a worker telecommute before. Now, as of 2 Fridays ago, there were 3,000 people telecommuting. And frankly, there's probably a whole bunch of them that will continue to telecommute. You know, they're trying as much as possible to maintain social distance, you know, because they never shut. You know, and every worker has their temperature taken as they go into work, has a decontamination kit, and is required to wear a mask. So there's some things like that that just may be part of what being reopened may look like. And then there may be, you know, some employers and some workers who are impacted by the fact that even if they're open, they're still going to struggle. I don't know about the rest of you. I don't know the next time I'm going to go to the movie theater. And I'm a big movie buff, but I think there's just anxiety about, you know, being in close proximity in a tight space indoors for a few hours. So I think there are going to be entities like that may be affected for a while. You know, for those of you who are looking at going to college, you know, frankly, colleges and universities are, I think, largely still trying to think through what the fall is going to look like. And even for colleges and universities that offer classes in person, you know, the days of, my brother works at the UW, you know, his freshman year, he took a psych class in a lecture hall that had 1,200 people in it, packed shoulder to shoulder. That's just not going to happen in the near term until there's a vaccine. And so, in terms of just sort of operationally how things look different, that's some of the operational stuff. But I'd come back to what I said early on. My hope is that this is also an inflection point for our country to solve some of the problems that need to be solved. We had housing insecurity before this pandemic. It has been amplified by the pandemic. It has been made worse by the pandemic. And my hope is that you see policymakers focus their energies on things that address some of that systemic problem. I mentioned access to the internet as another example, access to healthcare. You know, any number of these problems were problems before, but hopefully you'll see action on them going forward. And then the final thing I'll just say is, I think we got a good reminder by this pandemic that there are things that need to be made in the United States. You know, the fact that we're relying on China or any other country for personal protective equipment, for masks or for swabs, for testing, I think highlights the fact that there's some of this stuff we just got to do in America, and having a United States industrial policy really, really matters.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. I probably have time for maybe one or two short ones, and then I got a dash, but I want to make sure I hear from those who want to be heard.
Yeah, hi. So I would like to ask, you mentioned pivoting towards a new, like, positive normal after all of this, with healthcare and housing development and the like.
Yeah.
I'm curious, do you think that with the development and implementation of stimulus checks, that universal basic income is possible or likely in the near future?
I'm not sure. I know there's been a lot of debate about it. I'm not sure. I think what you've seen, the rebate checks were largely an acknowledgement that a lot of the federal intervention was going to take a while. And that one way to help people just get through what is a really challenging time was to quickly try to deliver cash. And it was not necessarily, it's a pretty blunt instrument, at least in the CARES Act, the way it was done was pretty blunt. I mean, there was some effort to make it somewhat progressive so that, Bill Gates didn't get a $1,200 check, so that it phased out at higher incomes. There's continued conversation around acknowledging that the best way to deal with unemployment and economic insecurity caused by this pandemic is to keep people attached to their jobs. And so there's been different sort of approaches and different policies that have been identified to do that. There's my colleague Pramila Jayapal has a bill called the Paycheck Guarantee Act. There's an alternative approach that has the same goal called the Employee Retention Tax Credit, that instead of giving employers a grant, would give them a tax credit to basically keep people employed. Even if they're not able to work right now, keep them employed so that they can continue to get their paycheck and get their benefits. And I think that's, there's an appreciation that or something like it needs to be an option during this period. The other thing, though, that I would say is there have been disproportionate impacts of this pandemic, certainly in the health care arena, in the public health arena. We've seen disproportionate impacts based on race and also based on income. If you work in a white collar job in an office building, your ability to continue to work and earn a paycheck in a way that maintains social distance probably means you're working from home, is far greater than someone who's either in a blue collar manufacturing job or a retail job. And that's part of the reason the economic pain has been felt more, frankly, by the folks who can least afford the economic pain. And that's something I think policymakers are going to continue to grapple with. Part of that is also acknowledging the importance, particularly for those of you who are graduating, of doing what you're doing, and that is achieving educational attainment. Here's what we know. We know that as educational attainment goes up, so does the likelihood that someone will be employed rather than unemployed. We also know that as educational attainment goes up, so do wages. So if you care about income inequality in this country, and I do, you should care about making sure more people have access to education. In our country, if you're a high school dropout, not in our country, in our state, if you're a high school dropout, you're 17% of our state's population. You're 55% of our state's prison population. I don't know about the rest of you. I'd much rather invest on the front end in educating young people than on the back end in prisons and unemployment. And that's the decision that we make as a society. And so, frankly, there's a whole lot of policy discussion that will need to be had, not just around UBI, but around other policies to ensure that more people can make ends meet in a dramatically changing economy.
All right, thank you.
You bet. I mean, let me just say one other thing on that front. One, I appreciate the question, but two, the last 2 minutes that I just had with you is trying to acknowledge that like all this stuff is complicated, and it doesn't lend itself to a bumper sticker, right? I mean, it's one of my frustrations. And I don't say this to lob a partisan bomb. I'm just being honest with you. One of my frustrations with the current administration is that it tends to, I think, simplify what are really complex issues in a way that often means that the solution doesn't adequately address them. If you are left behind in our economy right now, the explanation by the president has largely been to either scapegoat immigrants or to scapegoat what he refers to as loser trade deals. But I actually think the reality is far more complicated. My first job when I was in high school in Port Angeles was something that no longer exists. I worked at a video store. We used to have these things called video stores. It really pains me that the words "be kind, please rewind" mean nothing to my daughters. because they live in this, and you live in this amazing world of Netflix and YouTube and on demand and Amazon Prime, and being able to have a massive amount of content available at your fingertips. And so that change is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's pretty bad if you were Rick, the guy who owned Westside Video in Port Angeles, or if you were young Derek Kilmer and that's how you earned a paycheck and helped pay for college. When my kids were born, we would go to the Methodist Church in Gig Harbor, and then our tradition after church was to go to the Borders Bookshop in Gig Harbor. When my kids were little, there were 1,400 Borders bookshops in this country, employing 34,000 people in this country. And now there are 0. And frankly, it's not for any of the reasons that the president has suggested are the causes of economic disruption in this country. When I was young, my dad and I would go hiking a lot, and he liked to, he was a big photographer. So we'd go to Kit's Camera on First Street in Port Angeles, and he'd buy a bunch of Kodak supplies. Kit's Camera doesn't exist anymore. Kodak, when I was a kid, employed 160,000 people in this country. It now employs 4% of that, in part because we all have, our cameras are our phone, and we don't print photos anymore. We post them. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's probably a bad thing if you're one of the tens of thousands of people at Kodak who lost their jobs. And so I think I share this with you, one, to just acknowledge that sometimes these challenges are complicated, and two, that requires all of us, certainly for me as a policymaker, but all of us as participants in our democracy, to have the patience to try to sit through something other than a bumper sticker answer. So I hope what I just shared with you wasn't too painful, and for those who had the patience to listen to it, thank you. That's one step of trying to fix some of the problems that need fixing.
Mr. Kilmer, I've one more question if you have time.
Sure. I may have to make this the last one. Tyler, I don't want to offend you if I ask if someone who hasn't asked a question.
Oh, no. Yeah, I'm fine. That's fine.
Before I have to sign off. So anybody want to chime in? And if not, I'll take Tyler's question. But okay, Tyler, I think it's all you.
All right. Thank you. So real quick, with regards to the entire nation, I mean, we can focus specifically within Washington if you'd like, but the danger of, I've seen on multiple, either side of the aisle, media and news sources, they're all very agenda driven, be it left or be it right. So I've seen some news sources, they'll immediately post or send out a story on the newest event without getting all the facts. And I find oftentimes by the time all the facts are out, it's too late for the media to fix it. So people are only getting maybe half the facts. So I'm just wondering how we can kind of ensure that when people hear news, which is, how they know what's going on around them politically, socially, culturally, how can we ensure that people are getting all of the facts and not any half truths or, 10% of the facts?
It's a really good question, Tyler, and I wish I had a really good answer for you other than to encourage you and others to, one, try to get information from a diversity of sources. There are still, thankfully, some sources that frankly don't have a bias ideologically. To the degree that you can find some of those, I think there's value in it. I end up usually in the course of my morning checking about 15 to 20 different information sources. I just have tabs up on my browser, and which is an old school way of reading news. But I also like to know what my social media companies don't think I am interested in, because sometimes even just seeing those headlines, I say, oh, I'm kind of interested in that. Some of it's also, if something sounds like it may not be right, doing that next step of of researching it. You know, there's actually a lot of fact-checking sites, particularly on things that are said by politicians. There's factcheck.org and Snopes and others that, you know, really try to debunk political bull. And I think that's really important. And is also part of our jobs as participants in our democratic republic, is to try to make sure that that we're doing what we can to be informed. I guess I'll leave it at that. There are other things like, so a lot of elected officials have information that they put out. I do a weekly email newsletter, and I post on Twitter and on Facebook. I kind of suck at Instagram, but I'm trying, you guys. I welcome you to follow me. We do town hall meetings. Now we do them virtually, but, you know, traditionally I usually do, you know, more than a dozen a year, and on top of visits to high schools and things like that. So I think that's part of staying informed too, is both hearing what your elected officials have to say, and as many of you did over the course of this Zoom meeting, asking questions that will hold your elected officials accountable. That's part of our jobs as well. So I know I got a dash. I'm sorry, I have to be on a 4 o'clock call. But let me, first of all, in closing, just congratulate each of you as graduates. It really matters that that you've stuck with it. It's a great accomplishment, and I hopefully one of just many that you'll continue to make in our community. 2, I just want to encourage you to continue to look for opportunities to make a difference in your community. We need you. There's a lot of challenges in our country right now. There's a lot of things that need fixing, and frankly, having visited your school in the past and knowing the investment your teachers have made in you and the investments you've made in yourselves, frankly, we're going to count on you to be part of solving some of these problems. We're going to need you. And then finally, let me just make one final pitch for your continued involvement. You got to vote. Yeah, you got to vote. If you're 18, please vote. If you're interested in getting more involved in that, as I mentioned, we've really made it a priority to try to engage high school students by offering internships and even paid internships. If that is of interest to you, just pop an email over to Colin at DerekKilmer.com, and we'll find ways to engage you in a way that hopefully will be constructive and productive for you. And again, thanks for being willing to hang out with your congressman for an hour.
Thank you for spending your time with us, sir.
You bet.
Congressman Kilmer, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for the last few years joining North Kitsap High School. We really appreciate your time. We're very grateful for you. Thank you.
You bet. Everybody stay safe. Keep washing your hands.
Bye, guys. Thank you. Thanks, Colin.
Thanks.
Thank you. We'll see you soon.
See ya.